Hey, it looks like we are live here. So, welcome everyone. This is Harbor Clinical and Viadoc's LinkedIn Live from afterthought to priority, streamlining data management and biostatistics. The purpose of this conversation is just that, to have a conversation. We really wanted a format where we could answer your questions directly and make this conversation actionable. So this is a live Q&A. Please feel free to leave any questions that you have in the comments or provide us your perspective. We'd love to hear that as well. I will go ahead and kick us off here with some introductions. My name's Tess. I'll be the moderator for today's conversation, and I will pass it over to the first of our two very talented SMEs for today's conversations, Greg.
Hello, everyone. Yes, my name is Greg Tulo. I am the Chief Customer Officer here at Viedoc. I've been with this organization for a number of years now, looking at customer success, enablement, technical support, best practice training, all within our software ecosystem. So prior to this role, I was a lead global head of data management and biostatistics at a CRO, where we were building out data management offerings. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. This is a topic that's near and dear to me. So thank you.
And hi, everyone. I'm AJ Zadwani. I'm a vice president here at Harbor Clinical. I've been in the clinical trial industry pretty much most of my career. I've spent a lot of that time in data management. I've had leadership positions in the data management space at sponsor companies and also in the CRO industry. So I'm very excited to work with Greg on this meeting and look forward to answering any questions that you have.
Thank you both. Okay, well, I can see there's a few people that are just joining us. So this is from afterthought to priority, streamlining data management and biostatistics. And as we jump into our conversation today, I thought it would be helpful to start by defining the term biometrics and how that encompasses biostatistics and data management. AJ, is that something you could kind of talk to us about how you define?
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. So when I think of biometrics primarily as biostatistics and data management working together side by side to provide the deliverables needed to indicate if the clinical trial met its endpoint and what the outcome of the trial was. Some people also include medical writing for sure, and I've seen that as well. But for the purposes of our discussion today, I'm focusing primarily on biostatistics and data management as the main descriptor for biometrics.
Helpful. Okay, well, I think it would be great if we could have the two of you give us a bit of an overview of the current biometric status quo and what are the challenges that you're seeing in the industry today.
Yeah, AJ, do you want to run with that one first?
Sure, I'm happy to. So I think what I see is I see a few different things. I see people at different levels of adoption with regard to how they view these two functions. So there's some companies some sponsor companies that view these functions as two different functions. So when they're viewed as two different functions, completely two different functions, and not really working well, you see a lot of disconnects between the two groups. You see back and forth that happens late in the game. You see feedback that comes to the other department late in the game. But then you also have on the other side, you have organizations that are quite integrated with regard to their data management and biostatistics. And in those cases, you see that they're planning in advance for how all the data will be managed, what the end is supposed to look like, and how we'll get to the end, how the third-party external data is going to be included in the final data sets for the study, and how we're going to get there to ensure it's clean for one and ready to be analyzed and provided for that final CSR. That's sort of what I'm seeing. Unfortunately, I'm still seeing this wide spectrum of some clients are on one side of the spectrum and some on the other.
Yeah, and I would say we see the same thing on the software vendor side of the fence. We have some of our customers come in and they know exactly what they need. Everything is well thought out, and then we can work with them to very rapidly deploy a solution that works for them. And other times it's kind of comes in as you're building the solution and people say, oh, well, what about this? What about that? How do we achieve this goal? And it's a little bit more disjointed. And while, of course, we still get there in the end, it's a slightly more arduous process. With things being more and more complicated too, uh, the problem seems to be getting worse. It's a good problem to have. There's so much data out there, but it comes from different solutions. So I see sort of an older modality, sometimes still in use, where there's one vendor for EDC, and then your ePro and eCOA data is coming from another system. Maybe someone's trying to integrate with EHR or the newer things, wearables. How do we get all that data in, hopefully to a single source, so that the data management and data science teams can start to receive actual insights from a lot of noise that comes in with all of this data. So how do we achieve those goals? That's what I'm always asking myself and asking my customers. What is your end goal here? How can we help you find those signals amongst all of this and streamline the process?
Yeah, and again, along those lines, I think the complexity of these trials, as you alluded to, Greg, we are now collecting more and more data than we ever have in our clinical trials, and just keeping up with that. And as I mentioned, that spectrum of where clients are in that roadmap, if you're a client that hasn't really streamlined your data, you're coming into the industry at a really tough time where you because you're being asked by your spot by your company, how about this? How about this? How about this? Answer this question. So many questions we're trying to answer during our protocol. And of course, how do we answer questions? We answer questions through data. And so it just magnifies the problem that if we're not streamlined, if we're not integrated with regard to how we're handling these two functions, it just creates more challenges for both groups, for one, and then certainly for the rest of the project team, and then ultimately for the final product at the end of the study.
Absolutely. And then how do you have many encounters with groups that are trying to do cross-study analysis where maybe they're collecting very similar data from different sources and then trying to merge that at the end of the study? And maybe it's not all formatted correctly. Maybe it's not all normalized in a way that would really benefit that. How do you handle those situations? Or do you encounter them
No,
at all?
yeah, and I think I think what ends up happening there is a lot of that is done as outside of systems. So it's done as a standalone project,
Hmm.
versus something that can be looked at in real time with, active data and past data all at once. Instead, a lot of these companies are taking data and, either doing it manually using, things like SAS program in the back end, or they've purchased additional warehouse tools and taking that archive data, loading those archive data, and then looking at it. So again, it's another step in the process where they're exporting this data from one source to another, and then are limited with regard to looking at the current study data with regard to what they already have. So, this is, and this is something that could these kinds of questions get asked in future studies? Well, how did patients do in this scenario in the last study? And that may not be readily available. That question may not be readily available at your fingertips. So it's what do you do with the data so it's available to answer questions, for future trials.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a good consideration that folks should be asking themselves in the beginning. Are we going to have a data lake, a data hub, or a data bridge just to let these systems talk to each other? Or, something I find myself constantly speaking to is, could we just integrate a lot of the data collection going back to a single study scope? Can we do as much as possible to have a single solution where all the data is collected in one place, so that there are fewer of these export import processes, less reconciliation, which of course is less room for error and less man hours. The fewer people have to be involved with getting that data in. So it's something else I'm sure we can continue to expand on throughout the conversation.
And just to go back to my initial thought about where customers are in their journey, there are some customers that have already planning for this, which is fantastic, right? So they are anticipating 5, 6 studies, getting some of those tools in place to do this cross-study analysis now. But then again, if you're just getting into the clinic, or if you've had 1 or 2 studies and you're not thinking that forward, then when you want to do it, it becomes tricky. Not necessarily tricky, but just clumsy is the right word.
Mm.
Clumsy in how to do it.
AJ,
And
that's
yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yes.
no, you're good, Greg. I was just going to say, AJ, that's a interesting train of thought, and I'm wondering if the two of you could discuss some more of the benefits of having a unified biometric solution.
Yeah, I mean, again, just to build off that, so I focused on reviewing data. So if you just take a step back and if you look at cleaning data, let's look at it from that perspective. Just to go a little different direction. From a data cleaning perspective, if you have these two processes in sync, unified, what ends up the end result will be faster, cleaner data that is no surprise to anyone earlier during the process. Your number of unlocks should drastically reduce. Your number of issues that come up from your Pinnacle 21 reports will be significantly less if your biostats team is involved earlier in the process. And that only happens if these two groups are streamlined. And streamlined by process primarily, because the process drives data access. The process drives how the data will be reviewed and what will be done with the data. And we need technology to support that, which is certainly in Greg's wheelhouse.
Mhm. Yeah, and I see instances where you do have the teams where there's really obvious tight-knit integration, where it's clear a statistician was heavily involved in writing the protocol. There's a great SAP, great statistical analysis plan. Everything is laid out. But sometimes it's the data managers who are going to build the study, or data science teams or programmers who get involved at the very last minute. And sometimes they'll find things that were maybe overlooked or that are necessary in order to drive a study workflow from a database perspective, that need to be added to a protocol or just more part of the initial scoping. And sometimes you see the opposite, where the statisticians are not involved with, say, user acceptance testing of a database until like the 11th hour. And they're suddenly finding things like, oh, we really need a variable to be named a certain way, or this variable that's key for our statistical analysis is simply not there. And it wasn't even spelled out in the protocol adequately. So you see that as like a worst case scenario, because that really slows down the overall process.
Yeah, and just to build on that, that's a fantastic comment. In addition to not participating in UAT, you also want to make sure the biostatistician at least is aware of data transfer plans and has the opportunity to review them and comment on them to ensure that they have what they need in the format they need it, to be able to do what, to make the analysis that's needed. In so many of our trials, as I'm sure Greg, you can attribute to, is ECOA is the ECOA and EPRO. That's the primary endpoint for a lot of trials that we work on. It doesn't have to be, or lab data, one of those three, and that's not necessarily that's entered manually into EDC. So leaving the biostatistician out of how that data comes in, or not necessarily including that biostatistician in that process, I think can lead to future problems down the road.
Absolutely. And I love that you brought up how important ePro and eCOA data is nowadays. We're seeing that more and more as primary endpoints. So we're looking at quality of life data and such. And it surprises me sometimes how many organizations I've worked with that are just starting to adopt the idea of doing this electronically. They're still a little bit nervous about it. And they quickly see the benefits of using not only an ePro or eCOA tool, but one that's integrated with a core database as well. So when the patient enters their data and clicks submit, it's immediately stored in the clinical database, nowhere else. So no reconciliation, no data transfer plans. That data is secure, it's attributed to the subject. And if you build the system correctly, of course, you're not going to have missing data. The patient has to complete all of the requisite questions. So that gets you to that point that I believe you said, faster, cleaner data, or cleaner data faster. It's the same idea,
That's
you
same
want that.
idea.
That's our end goal here. Let's
Yep.
get to that point. And by the same idea, been having a through line recently of just how can we uncomplicate things, not just in a workflow idea, but also as far as data management is concerned. And a study comes to mind recently where there was this mountain of lab data. They were collecting everything under the sun, and it was an incredibly complicated API integration with the lab's core system, which was the source record. That's where the data was housed, and they wanted to push it all into the EDC. And we were looking at this, and finally someone asked a question, but why? What is the site doing with this data? It's already collected in a compliance system. That output is perfectly fine and ingestible into our stats program. Do we need to do this? Or maybe do we simplify this and only collect the one or two parameters that the site needs to make a decision? And it was sort of an aha moment for this entire study team. And a very, very complicated project became much more simple. And we were able to move forward a lot faster.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example that really points to thinking about how we're going to use the data that we collect. I'm a little bit old school, and and back when we tried to keep case report forms really simple, we always asked the question, what are we going to do with this data once we collect it? And so I don't think that happens as much as it used to, unfortunately. But it's still it still does happen. I'm not saying it doesn't, but it seems like it doesn't happen as much because I work on a lot of studies where I look at all this data. It's like, what are you going to do with this? For the reasons that you just mentioned. It's not that you don't need it, but do you need it? How do you need it collected? And how exactly is it going to be used for your analysis? So that I think goes to planning, a lot of planning. And you know, and and the people that can plan that are the biostatisticians, because ultimately they're the ones producing the analysis at the end, um, and the tables and listings and figures, and they're gonna tell you, here's what we need to prove, to document the endpoints for the study to help us make the decision of what this data looks like. And they'll tell you, do we need all this? Oh, I'm not going to do anything with this. But do we ask that? But it might be used for other reasons. I'm not saying we don't need the data. I'm just saying it could
Sure.
be used for other reasons. But at least we're brainstorming, and in your situation, at least people are talking about the use of the data for go forward purposes.
So I'm hearing a value where I think we have a lot of alignment of bringing in the biometrics, the statisticians, the data managers, the
Absolutely.
data science folks as early into the process as possible. And I would probably say that should be when you start discussing the protocol, when you're drafting
Yeah,
it all. These folks should have
absolutely.
some input. Excellent.
and and I think staying engaged, right? Because what sometimes happens is you might see a biostatistician involved in the beginning stages of the protocol, and then you may not see them again until close to the end. I'm not again, this varies study by study, of course, but then they identify problems later at the end, and the data manager is saying, well, I could have used that information 6 months ago. Now
Yes.
I've got to go chase a site for queries that this data was collected much earlier.
Mm, mm.
So
Yeah.
great point.
And I would say my final thought on that is a pitfall we sometimes see groups run into where the data management unit is treated as such a separate department and there's such little integration between them and say clinical operations early on that suddenly clinical operations is running ahead with a first patient in date and they say this is when we're going to do it and they hand the programmers, the database configuration team, whatever you call them at your organization, they get handed the protocol and all these supporting documents and they say okay, great, we can get started. When's FPI? And they say, well, our first patient, and we want it in 6 weeks. You say, oh, okay. Now we're talking about collecting data in maybe it's multiple systems, and you have to do it at a breakneck pace. Maybe it's still one system, which certainly is a little more feasible, but still, that database, these data collection tools are some of the most vital things in your study. If you don't have the right tool for the job or you rush the configuration of them, that's only going to lead to errors and mistakes, which impacts data quality. And at the end of the day, that's your submission. That's your submission that you're putting at risk.
Yeah, agreed. And again, that's why it's so important, not to be a little bit cliche, but these two groups should be streamlined for this
Mhm.
purpose, so that they're, with the entire project team, because they're so vital to the outcome of the trial. These systems, some systems do take some time to put together, as you mentioned. So the more upfront notice, the more understanding of that, certainly will yield a more efficient startup and a higher quality study during the process.
And I would certainly just double click on the point of, if you are using multiple systems for whatever reason, and my opinion is, whenever possible, try to get one solution that does, the vast majority of what you need. But if you're using system A as EDC and system B as your IRT, maybe it's supply management, maybe it's just randomization, whatever it is, make sure you start early with both of those, because if you want them talking to each other in real time, you're going to be working with some APIs, or maybe just very rapid fire data extract imports, however you're doing it. But these things take time, and they must be tested, and tested very, very well, in order to have a seamless experience. So if you're going to be using these disparate systems, add even more time to your timeline to get this going. Not to even mention, the money aspect of that as soon as you're dealing with multiple vendors.
Yeah,
So
and to
Greg,
build on that,
we have an audience question that is similar to what you're just discussing. So how do you address the challenges of integrating legacy systems with a new platform? So I heard you saying start early, make sure you've thought about your testing strategy. What else should this individual consider?
Yeah, so look at your risk profile, of course. What is your risk tolerance? Especially if you're moving from a legacy system that, let's say it's going offline, it's being retired, you still have a study that's going and collecting data. You need to move it to another system. So start early. Make sure you do your own user requirement specification testing early on to ensure that the system that you're leaning towards does what it needs to do. But also recognize that if you're moving from a legacy system to a more modern platform, there are going to be necessary differences. There are certain things that are going to look different, feel different, and there's usually a very good reason for that. These are newer systems, there's newer ideas in place. Sometimes they can be a lot more efficient. So you have to pick the right platform. But then you have to talk about the data transfers. And I've been involved with many of these projects over my career, and they can be unbelievably complicated. They can be a lot of fun, but they do take quite a bit of work and planning. You need to decide, are we collecting all of the data into the new system and effectively recreating every single patient profile? Or are we collecting only new data going forward, which only really works if you don't need to make actionable decisions, either as an individual user at the site or from the system perspective? Does it need to show something based on previously entered data? You have to ask all these questions in order to make the right choice there. And then finally, there's going to have to be some reconciliation after you've imported the data that you decide to move over to the new system. So make sure you have a plan in place for that in the beginning, so you can show to the regulatory agencies that you've done your due diligence, that you can say, yes, with some degree of certainty, system A, the old one, now matches system B, the new one, and be prepared to prove that.
yeah, and just to add, having gone through a couple of significant migrations myself, and just one of the biggest things that is needed is a storyboard and documentation to support what's going on. Memories fade, um, processes, get fuzzy after a period of time, but documents last forever. So take the time, write it down while it's fresh in your mind. Uh, you know, Pictures are worth 1,000 words, and just really have in mind what you're doing, what the rationale is, so that when someone 6 months from now looks at it, it's like, why do we do this? What was the rationale? And how do we do it? You have that readily available.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. And use technology to help you with that. I've been, recently we've been using more and more of the embedded AI tools that are available to all of us within, various programs. And I know, as a group that uses one system that has an embedded AI will record most meetings. Will take a transcript, and you can ask the AI, summarize this for me. And when we've looked at those reports, they're pretty accurate based on, we say, did this thing catch all of our key points from this very long discussion and boil it down to, 6 bullet points? And the answer is generally yes. Like it does a really good job. So use these tools to help you in your documentation process, because as you said, not only do memories fade, one of the old adages is if it's not written down, it did not happen. So make sure you write it down.
Very helpful. So if we think about this from a different lens, what are some strategies sponsors should consider when looking to implement a unified solution for biometrics?
I mean, from my perspective, I'll go back to my analogy at the beginning. Where are you in the spectrum of clinical trials? Are you later in the process where you have everything, not everything, but a lot of things figured out, or are you just starting out in your journey of running studies? So I think just understanding where you are in that journey is important because that'll help drive some of your decisions. And then what's the company strategy as well? Is the company a one program company, or is the company going to have the plan for the company to have multiple programs? And the reason that drives the strategy is because then it goes to what we spoke about earlier with regard to how many tools do you need, how much integration do you want to invest in now versus let's do what we need to finish these trials, see if we get favorable data and then move forward, or we have a really solid roadmap. This is our plan. We're funded for it. This is what we're doing. We're going to have a bunch of studies. Let's be really efficient with the selection that we have and go with it. Let's make a strong commitment that this is what we're going to do. So I think those are some of the key factors I would consider in deciding how to select the right vendor, because then that'll point you to the type of solution you're looking for. And from there, you can start to filter down what it is about the vendor specifically that you like and what makes sense for you as an organization.
It's great. Yeah, from my end, to add to that, I would say, yeah, know what, if you're coming from a different system, certainly think about what worked really well for you and think about what didn't work. What were the persistent, frustrating parts of that platform? And take note of that. And ask vendors, okay, here's a situation, a hypothetical based on something that actually happened. How would your system handle this differently? And most vendors should be able to show you like why their solution will be better than what you've used in the past or what you might have seen already. That's really important. So ask those really difficult questions. And I mentioned earlier, having your user requirement specifications spelled out really well and share that with your vendor, because you don't want any surprises right before you sign or after you sign up and you start a build process. And maybe you have some absolute requirement you cannot do without, and it turns out that vendor doesn't support it. And I would take this as far as, have a checklist. If you're at a big conference where there are many vendors, you go from booth to booth and ask them these questions and just tick it off. You might find that you don't ever get to 100%, but you might get to 90%, or maybe someone's missing something that you could live without. We're all still looking for, I call it the unicorn of systems, the one that does everything just absolutely perfectly. But you can get really close based on what you need. And be open to things being a little bit different. From your old system might do it this way, new system does it a slightly different way. That's just part of it. When you're moving to a new ecosystem, you have to be flexible with your established workflows. Sometimes that has to shift a little bit. So yeah, that's it. But then you were also mentioning, well, I think you said support. How do we do
Yeah.
this? If you didn't, I would say support. Talk to
Yeah.
them about their support. You mentioned timelines. Talk about their timelines. Look at their track record. How often are they getting releases out the door? How do they communicate known issues or bugs with you? Make sure that you have an open line of communication with folks. And usually that starts right from the beginning. You're going to work with probably someone from a sales team or a technical group. Make sure you like those folks. That's important too, because they're probably indicative of the overall company culture. And that's going to be the folks that you're working with pretty closely over the next several years for each study.
Yeah, and again, a few more things for consideration is flexibility of deployment. So you may not have answers to all your questions. You may not know answers to all the questions about where you're going with these systems in the beginning. So the question is, can the vendor grow with you as you grow? Can you add things in a modular basis? Can you change your functional model of data management and biostatistics along the way? So versus using a full service solution to perhaps more of a hybrid solution, an FSP solution, or ultimately bringing the work in-house. How will your vendor respond if it's a technology vendor that we're talking about, how your technology vendor will respond as you change as a company with regard to how your organization changes and how your organization grows, and can that vendor scale with you as you go from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3? So those are some additional considerations as well. And that's why I started with what is the company's roadmap and what is the company's goal with pursuing a vendor at this point.
We have a couple audience questions. So one is, what are some common concerns or pain points when switching to a unified platform, and how can these be addressed?
I'll go with a few. I think I sort of led to it from a pain point perspective is if you get some of these things wrong. If you have a vendor that requires you to buy all the modules at once, and that's not where you're ready, or requires that your IRT system needs to be of this in this capacity or not, that's a potential pain point. What flexibility and choice do you have? So that's one potential pain point, how flexible your vendor is. Another pain point is ease of implementation and ease of, is there an actual roadmap? Is there an actual plan to get you up to speed, and how quickly will that take? So that's something that's a potential pain point as well. Obviously, the longer, the worse it could be.
Yes.
So that's some of the things that I'm thinking of. And Greg, certainly chime in.
No, these are good points. The other things that I always looked out for were if it is a unified platform, is it truly unified, or is it sort of this is one part of the system that, yes, on a technical standpoint, you could say is unified, but they have a support team and a separate roadmap. And then this part of the system has a support team and a roadmap. And then the end user experience becomes a little clunky, where they are in the EDC, but it's clear when it's time for randomization, they're kind of shifting gears to another area, which may or may not work as well as the core base application. So look for that smoothness in the technology to ensure that it's all working well. That's a piece. You touched on, do you have to buy everything, or can you just buy the pieces you need for a study? So maybe in study A, I don't need ePro, but in study B, I do. You should be able to just buy the parts of the system that you want. Clear and transparent pricing modules are always, I think, on top of mind for everybody. Make sure when you're evaluating a vendor, you're not going to be hit with any surprises. They should be telling you everything right up front, because that puts a lot of the power and the drive in your hands. If you need to add another module on down the line, exactly what it's going to cost, so you can plan for that. And look where else they put things in your hands. Are you going to be completely reliant on that vendor to add sites to the system, to add subjects? If we're talking about data managers and programmers, will they need the vendor to duplicate a study if you want to use it as a template, or can you do it yourself? In my world, I would prefer to be able to do that myself. I don't want to have to submit a support ticket and wait days or weeks. Can you do a mid-study change on the fly? These are other things that are sometimes crucial and critical. And the fewer players that you have to rely on to get that job done, the better, because it gives you control of the timeline and, of course, costs.
And just one more thing to add to your list, Greg, is what's the infrastructure we need to work, what the sponsor needs to work with your system? Does the sponsor need to hire an administrator, if you will? Does the sponsor need to bring all groups together, all functional groups together, to to implement a system like this. Because if you're a small company, you may not have the time for that. You may not have the budget to bring on more resources for that, but you need a unified platform. Part of when I work with vendors, what I'm hoping for is they'll come to us with solutions. Because I may not have answers to all their questions. They're excellent asking questions, but I may not have answers, especially if I'm a small company or have a small group where I don't know all the answers. Here's my problem. Give me your recommended solution for helping me get there. And so I think so a pain point is, how much support do I need to give personally to
Mhm.
answer questions to get this spun up? Because I may just not know the answer, and I may not be comfortable giving you an answer because I don't know all the information of where things know that this is an important area that we should be going in. So I'm leaning on the vendor for their recommendation.
Yeah, that's a great point. And when I think back on my career, where I always had the best or highest level of success was when I had a vendor that supported me, where I would say, here's what we're trying to do. What's your best practice in your system? How do I get there? And then they'll respond right away. So again, I'm not waiting days, but either it's a phone call or an email, and they say, here's what we'd recommend. Oh, and by the way, if you do that, this is probably the next question you're going to ask. So let's address that right now. So they're setting you up for success. You have those people you can call or email who can get back to you rapidly, especially during, if you are down to the line and you're building the final bits of the database, you're doing UAT, you're trying to get in those last comments and, say like an edit check just isn't firing correctly. You want to be able to have a resource where you can go out and get those answers. That's really important. So what does the support infrastructure look like in general? What does the customer enablement and success look like?
Yeah.
Next question is, how do you measure the success of implementing a unified solution in terms of cost effectiveness and time savings?
Mm.
Greg, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, for us, when I was building out various data management units, it was the cost piece, of course. There's, well, how much is the system for this study going to cost us? Full stop. If we're using many, many other systems, you can just add those up, and then you can look at the unified system, and it's just right there on the paper. You're comparing the numbers. So that's the easy part. But then there's all the other costs. So what if it's a unified solution, but it's unbelievably difficult to use, and you have to spend hours training your staff both how to configure or program the system, your site staff has to be trained up. How complicated is the system to use? It might be incredibly inexpensive and look great, as far as the dollars go, but then the cost to enable it is really difficult or really high, or it's really complicated to build, and so it's going to take you a long time to build out your first study. So think about those aspects. Other users, other stakeholders. You're going to have your monitors, your CRAs, your study nurses, depending on where you are in the world. How will they interact with a solution? Is it easy for them to get to the data points that they need for their source data review or query management or whatever it is? Same story for data managers. And then never forget the site users. That is another one where you should be measuring what's that site impact. Did they say this system seems way too easy to use and we got in there and it was great? Or do they come in and say that was so complicated, we don't like it, and you get that kind of feedback sometimes from sites. So make sure your site people are happy. And then finally, and just so sadly often overlooked, what is that patient's experience, especially if you're using ePro, eCo outside of the clinic, in those slightly decentralized types of studies. Make sure the patients are having a good experience, not only with the technology, but also with the study itself. We're seeing more and more folks recommend that you poll the patients and ask them on occasion, how do you feel about what's being asked of you? Is it too much? Are you getting the information you need? Poll those patients, keep them engaged, make them part of the study and the process. So it's going off a little bit of a tangent there, but really look at the hard numbers, look at the time spent, and look at the effort. Those are the factors you really need to be considering.
Yeah, and from my perspective, just to add, all I would suggest is just put some structure around all those great points that Greg just made. When we do a clinical protocol, we justify what we're trying to accomplish. At the clinical protocol, those are our endpoints. So when you make a claim, when you make a pitch to purchase a unified system, what are your endpoints? What are you after? And then you measure those endpoints. All the steps that Greg just described are potential endpoints, whether they're primary, secondary, exploratory, who knows? But those are endpoints. And if you're going to submit this kind of request for approval, then how are you going to measure success? And I think if you plan for that, then you'll know the answer to that question.
Helpful. Another question is, how do I collaborate with my CRO to outsource data management or components of data management?
How do you collaborate? Is that the question?
Yes, correct.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I think what we're seeing what we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of these hybrid outsourcing solutions where a full service CRO, may not do all parts of the study. Rather, they may do, monitoring, project management, XUS work, etc. And in certain cases, the data management is being held by the sponsor or another provider. I think the best way to collaborate is by transparency. From the get-go, just when you get the RFP, when you create an RFP grid, just indicate what services are specifically being needed and indicate why. Indicate what the rationale is, what your strategy is for data management, biostatistics, and how your CRO, if they're awarded, will work in that environment. You have all the leverage in the world at the beginning of the study before the award is made. And I think if you leverage that, if you actually use that leverage and are upfront with it, I think that it'll be a very close relationship because everyone is clear on the expectation. But the sponsor will need to be clear with their expectations and be able to answer the CRO's tough questions that will come. And if you don't know what those questions are, the CRO should be asking those questions before the award goes out. So everyone is clear on how this will work, and everyone's clear what SOPs will be used, and what the interaction and communication will be like to ensure success in your trial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like all that. Yeah, roles and responsibilities, document it early, review it as a team early so there are no surprises. That's key. Because every now and then it will uncover a gap or a miscommunication about who's doing what. So establish that early and then work with your CRO or the tech vendor if you do identify a gap. Maybe CRO doesn't have data management or whatever the case, or maybe they have data management, they don't have build skill within the system of choice. Talk to that vendor, they might be able to refer you to someone.
Well, I am interested in both of your perspectives on what future trends and innovations do you anticipate, let's say, over the next 5 to 10 years?
Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
So, I mean, what I'm seeing right now, more and more talk about integrations. How can we integrate with X, whatever it might be? Is it EHR? Is it lab data? Is it wearables? And then once you do that, we spoke about this a little bit earlier. Well, how much data do you collect? What's the purpose of that data? Just because you can doesn't necessarily mean you should collect everything. And I know one of the early issues we were dealing with wearable integration was these watches are submitting heart rates and step counts and all of this every few seconds, and you're ending up with mountains and mountains of data. So what do? Are we taking a snapshot in time? Are we taking an average? Do we collect it all and let the poor stats team figure out what to do with it? Asking those questions from the beginning. The other piece that we're looking at is that there are some systems out there that are establishing themselves as one single thing, and they do that one single thing incredibly well. So maybe that's reporting or analytics or centralized statistical monitoring. Can those systems integrate with other tools? And can those tools, the EDC, for example, integrate back out with those platforms? So looking for a central repository to allow that transformation step before the data in, data out occurs, that's really important. So we're seeing more and more folks who want to do some data lake work where they can drop all the data from their studies, and that can be picked up by all sorts of other tools that they're using to help them out. Could be internally built things, it could be reporting systems, whatever the case might be. Yeah, AJ.
Yeah, again, just to add to your list, I see direct data capture becoming more of a driving force of our trials. As our sites evolve with their technology, as our hospitals continue to evolve with their EHR systems, there's more and more natural integrations of their data, which is source coming right into EDC systems. Now, while there already are e-source systems and they are being used, I acknowledge that. I just see more in that direction happening. I just think it just has to happen because there's so much transition taking place right now at these research sites, and that's just going to flow into our systems for sure. I also see these integrations becoming more streamlined, and allowing for faster review of data, allowing for greater access to leveraging data from different studies. So right now, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you're just starting your journey, you may not see the benefits or have the benefits of all these tools to look at your studies. But as these tools become easier to use, as data becomes easier to obtain from research sites, I think that'll just enable some of the companies that are still doing things a little bit piecemeal to be more in line with what some of the larger companies are doing now as well.
And I'm also starting to see, as the data comes in piecemeal, as it starts to come into like unified systems, or it's all being collected all in one, there's still the data out piece in the analytics, and to find systems that have some onboard reports is so nice because I don't know about you, AJ, but oftentimes a choke point in our organization was when someone needed a report, they needed it updated today, Wednesday, instead of Thursday, which is when we scheduled it. And now people have to scramble to make that happen because it was manual. Maybe they're using some of the more legacy tools for analytics. They work great, but still someone has to push a couple buttons. Look for a system that can do some of this for you, either through like a data hub or a data bridge that goes to some other platform, or maybe it's built right into the core system so that you can get your refreshed data reports at your fingertips and be able to customize those to answer the questions that your team members are going to be asking, you as a data manager or statistician all day. You say, oh, why you keep asking me the same thing? Here's a report, just go here, it'll be updated every single day. And now you can go do other things and they don't have to slow down their work and wait for you. So look for those kinds of tools as well. And I'm seeing more and more of those happen. Yeah, other predictions, I do love the eSource direct data capture aspect. Like I think that's a really exciting one. And I remember, 10 years ago, having conversations with folks about, who are really nervous about even ePro. And, one of the greatest questions ever was, well, how do I know that what they entered into that tablet thing is correct if they're not writing it on paper first? And it's like, well, how do you know that what they wrote on the paper was correct? You still don't really know that aspect. At some point, the data is originating from somewhere. And what we saw were that early adopters of direct data capture, maybe they're interacting directly with the EDC, but via tablet, they're skipping source records, source worksheets, and this kind of stuff. They're collecting this study specific data directly in a database. They're getting to that cleaner data faster part with a lot of simplicity. They're eliminating the need for transcription. There's no errors there, and the system can give them real-time feedback when they've made a mistake. That is so crucial.
Yeah, and again, with I also see a greater use of the wearable technology. I mean, maybe it's not even called wearables anymore. It'll be called something else. Other ways of collecting data without intervention, which is the direct data capture. Just to build on that direct data capture. just other means of collecting data from a patient for analysis purposes without significant intervention for anyone.
Yeah, love it.
Okay, we have
Excellent.
one more question. At what step in the vendor selection process should someone select a data management and biostatistics solution?
From my perspective, again, I think it depends on where you are in your journey, right? And what your overall company's plan is. So certainly, given that at the end of the day, you're going to be reporting data that you're collecting and you're going to be analyzing that data that you're collecting, of course, I'm biased. To me, that should be one of the first decisions that you make. But I also know that there's many other decisions that are needed with regard to that. So, and certainly we also know that many of the decision makers may not have data on top of mind along the way. So the answer from my perspective would be to make that decision as soon as possible, with the idea that that decision will be with you for the entire trial, and potentially for longer, based on what you decide to do in the future. So ideally, if you could think of your data strategy first, that would be great. But I know that that doesn't always happen, but as early as possible for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. Do things early. Don't Another mistake we sometimes see being made is that you'll know the vendor you're going to work with, but you delay the start of the database. Protocol's done. It's ready. You know what data you're going to collect, but you think, oh, well, first patient in isn't until early 2025. Well, if you have everything else ready to go, you have protocol approval and you're just waiting until the new year to get things going, maybe that's when the sites are available. Don't delay getting your database and all your data collection systems set up. You'd rather get them all ready and then have to take a little break and a breather than be rushing right at the last minute. And unfortunately, we see that happen all too frequently because it is kind of an afterthought. And remember that, right at that end state, right before you're going live, you're shipping different materials to sites. You're dealing with last minute site negotiations. There's always hiccups and personnel changes. There's always a million things happening right before you go live. And ideally, setting up your data collection systems and your data reporting systems is not one of those things. Get it done early.
AJ, I'm curious if you can provide your experience leveraging Biodoc as a solution to current challenges and just Harbor's experience working with them holistically.
Yeah, I mean, I think my personal experience is they're they're a great partner for us. They're very easy to work with. I find that their technology is very easy to build. I mean, it's been designed for without a programmer, for instance, to build studies. So we have the flexibility to have a data manager build studies within their system. And certainly they're willing to help us with whatever we need. One of the interesting conversations I had with them early on in our relationship is I said, we would just prefer, since you guys are the experts in the system, we just rather have you build all of our studies. And their answer was, no, we want you to do it because you can do it faster and you can do it, the study better. So they actually encourage us to do it versus just taking our business from us. So I thought that was a really interesting partnership approach, that they're giving up business and want us to do it. So from that perspective, that gave me a good sign from a partnership perspective on that approach. The other thing that has worked well for us is the ability to scale into these other modules. I mean, I talked about earlier about the benefit of adding modules over time as we need them. And certainly that approach is there, with their solution. So that helps. So some studies we have ePros, some studies we don't have ePros, some studies we have the RTSM, some studies we don't have that technology or organization, I should say. So it really it provides the flexibility that we need as we scale our business as well.
It's great
Okay,
to
well,
hear.
we have about 5 minutes left here. So I wanted to ask both of you, give me your 60-second final takeaways. If someone, wasn't able to join until part of the way through, what was your key takeaway from today's conversation?
Right.
Okay. What I always tell people at the end of your study, if you don't have good, clean data that's complete, you don't have a submission. And then all that work and all that money was for nothing. So start working with your data managers, your biostatisticians, your data scientists, your biometrics unit early, engage them very early, find the technology solutions that make sense for your study and for your organization. Try to find one, as AJ said, that will grow with you so you can build up processes and procedures within your org, because that just builds in efficiency and time and cost savings when you're using one or just a couple providers. Um, yeah, and just get all that done as quickly as you can. And certainly find folks that you align with very well. You want to make sure that you have the people alignment in addition to not just the tech alignment. If you're not getting along with those folks, or if you have a different company culture, that is something that you shouldn't underestimate.
That's excellent. And just from my perspective, just again, the understanding where you are in your journey as a sponsor and where you want to go, and do you have the ideas, the processes, and are your vendors positioned to help you as you grow? If you're a growing company, or if you're early stage in your development as a company, are you ready to grow? Is your partner ready to grow with you as you grow? And are they flexible enough to help you with your growth? So that's a key takeaway for me on that side. And then the other little more technical and team building takeaway is similar to what Greg said about inclusion of your biostatistician early, inclusion of data management and biometrics with your clinical team early, because too often they come at the end, and we need them to come much earlier in the process of the trial.
Well, thank you both so much for your time today. I learned a lot from the conversation and confident others did as well. Thank you everyone for attending. Again, this was From Afterthought to Priority, Streamlining Data Management and Biostatistics. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.